John Williams runs Shadow Government Statistics, analysis behind and beyond government economic reporting. He is online at shadowstats.com. John, welcome to This Week in Money.
Thank you for having me, Phil.
Today we're going to look at some inflation and unemployment numbers, what the government wants you to believe, and what the real numbers are. Let us start, John, with a look at the Federal Reserve's dual mandate, stable prices and maximum employment. I'm going to start off with the stable prices part. The other John Williams, president of the San Francisco Fed, a couple of days ago said inflation is running below the Fed's 2% target. Is he just talking hot air, or is that true?
Well, I guess it depends how you define inflation, but in terms of the way the average person views it, that was a lot of hot air.
Now, a lot of what the Fed talks about is core inflation, which, as you and I both know, does not include food and energy costs. But that's nuts because they make up almost a quarter of consumer spending. How can they not include these in any realistic projection?
Because they want to use the lowest possible target to make it look like they're meeting their goals. They've just refocused inflation. What they'll use is what they call the PCE deflator. That's for personal consumption expenditure in the gross domestic product. It's the biggest account in the gross domestic product. It reflects the consumer spending on goods and services. And they indeed have targeted that at 2% year over year. Now, that's not core inflation, although they like to talk about core inflation, which is lower. Right now, the number that they're targeting at 2% is running at 2.4%, so it's above what they would officially like to see. And normally that would cause them to raise interest rates. But despite the mandates of contained inflation and sustaining economic growth, the Fed's primary function is to keep the banking system afloat.
Now, the Fed is always talking about managing inflation, but a lot of folks feel that the Fed are the people who are creating inflation.
Oh, yes, indeed they are. That's been their recent function. The Fed through its various policies, can always create inflation, and it can always turn the economy into recession. It's often difficult to contain inflation and to stimulate the economy, and that's what they're finding right now.
I love this quote here, John, from Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke. He says, the Fed should consider doing more for the economy if inflation keeps falling. Is he living in a dream world?
He doesn't have any choices. So he's basically trying to put out something that the markets can view positively and react to. There's not much the Fed can do to stimulate the economy. Inflation is really a problem. The Fed's the issue behind it right now. And again, the Fed's primary function is to keep the banking system afloat. There's been a systemic solvency crisis underway here since the near financial collapse back in September 2008. And all the Fed's actions taken since then primarily have been aimed at propping the banking system, but they put it out under the guise of trying to prop the economy. But their concern is the banking system.
John, what do you make of this quote here, the Fed saying housing is the key to America's recovery?
Well, again, housing, that certainly would be is a key element of what would be helping the economy, but key to the recovery of the economy is the consumer. Mm-hmm. And the consumer's income. We're seeing a structural problem in income levels right now. Key to the recovery of the banking system would be the housing industry, because the mortgage issues are still impairing balance sheets of the banks and making it difficult for the banks to lend in the normal function, which would presumably help the economy. But the big issue right now is that the average U.S. household is not seeing any income growth. Income growth is actually been negative for some time. We've been seeing contracting income, adjusted for the government's inflation number, which I'll contend is significantly understated. But even so, incomes are down. If income cannot grow faster than inflation, there's no way that you can have sustained positive growth in in the broad measures of consumption and the GDP. You can buy a little bit of growth through debt expansion, but that's temporary, and that's what Mr. Greenspan was pushing over the last decade or two. He knew there was a problem there. This problem in consumer income has been one that's been unfolding for a long time. So he encouraged the consumer to build debt upon debt, and that helped to keep the economy afloat. But with the credit collapse, U.S. consumers don't have much option at debt expansion. Their incomes are still growing at a pace slower than inflation, and there's just no way that the U.S. economy can start chugging along under those conditions.
John, if that 2% is understated, we're all familiar with the government figure of 2%. What do you figure the real inflation rate is based on your calculations?
Well, again, it's a matter of definition.
Mm-hmm.
The way the CPI was initially calculated, the way it was utilized when it was, I guess the first big use of it was in the auto union contracts in the United States. The idea behind the CPI was that it was a measure of the annual change in the cost of living needed to maintain a constant standard of living. And that makes sense. If you're, if you want your wages to increase, at least you'd like them to keep up with inflation so that you can buy this year what you bought last year. They'd have a very simplistic approach. They'd have a constant basket of goods. They'd take, for example, they measure the price of a pound of beef, a gallon of gasoline, a loaf of bread, then they take that same basket of goods, price it out the next year. Whatever the total package had changed by, that's how much the cost of living had gone up by.
We're talking to John Williams. Sorry, John, go ahead.
In the early 90s, Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan and others started making terrible noises about how the U.S. CPI overstated inflation. And if, they could only bring inflation reporting under control and reduce the level of inflation, that would enable them to reduce the cost of living adjustments on entitlement payments such as Social Security here. And with that would help them to reduce the federal deficit. And you say, well, what do you mean inflation's overstated? They'd say, well, if steak gets too expensive, people will buy more hamburger. If they buy more hamburger, their cost of living is reduced. Inflation isn't as high. Well, that may be a true statement. It isn't in terms of a concept of an inflation that measures a constant standard of living. Eating hamburgers is not the same thing as eating steak.
John, tell us about what you see coming with what you're calling the coming great collapse, a hyperinflationary depression. Give us a sense of what that would look like.
Well, that's something that would be limited primarily to the United States or countries where the currencies remain directly tied to the U.S. dollar or dollarized countries.
Like Canada, right?
Well, Canada, there's no formal tie there between the currencies. Okay. You have a free and open market there, and once the U.S. dollar is under heavy selling pressure, to the extent anyone might intervene to keep the dollars most closely tied, they're going to want to back away. You take China, for example. They keep their currency fairly closely pegged to the U.S. dollar. But the problem is the U.S. dollar begins to sink against the rest of the world, and you see inflationary pressures from things such as oil prices. The countries that stay tied close to the U.S. dollar are going to be importing that inflation. If they don't want the inflation, they break away from the dollar, and they're okay. It's a circumstance that will have very negative implications for the U.S. economy, and that's something that will be reflected in Canada as well. But you're already seeing evolution of a system here where Canada is developing a stronger trade volume with other countries such as China. And a lot of that will happen, and it'll tend to mitigate the economy. I've always found that private enterprise can get pretty creative when it's hit with a crisis. People have been through down economies and have survived. What we're looking at here is beyond a difficult economy. In the case of the U.S. dollar, will be a currency that will become virtually worthless. The reason for that is that the U.S. has moved well beyond anything seen with any other major country. to bankrupt itself over the long haul. Our politicians have played games there and taking on obligations they knew they could never cover.
Yeah.
You go back to 2004 when they overhauled our Medicare system and prescription drugs. What they put in place then with Medicare added $8 trillion to the federal obligations that were unfunded. And that's the net present value of the unfunded amount. That's the amount of cash you'd have to have in day to be able to cover it in the future. At that point in time, our total gross federal debt was about that level, so they effectively doubled the obligations. Since then, you've gotten to a point that our obligations with our debt and with these unfunded liabilities top $80 trillion. That's 5 times our GDP.
Wow.
It's worsening fairly regularly now at a pace of $5 trillion, not couple hundred billion as it used to be, or even the trillion and $1.2 trillion or whatever seen in the last year or two. But we're up at a level at $5 trillion. If you look at the U.S. as though it were a large corporation and how its finances are going on a generally accepted accounting principle basis, and on that basis, we are bankrupt. There's no way we can ever raise enough taxes to cover it. We're not going to be able to borrow it, and what you end up doing is that type of circumstance. Usually, the government prints the money to cover its obligations. That'll give you hyperinflation, and that would have happened towards the end of this decade. But right now, the way that the Fed and the U.S. Treasury have responded to the financial crisis in 2002. 2007, 2008, that has brought the horizon much closer on that. I look at a hyperinflation now by 2014.
We are back with John Williams from Shadowstats.com, and let's look at the other half of the Fed's dual mandate employment. Last month, the U.S. employment rate hit 8.3%. That's the one we are most familiar with. That's the one that makes the government look best. That's what we call U3, but there's a couple of other measures. There's U6. How is this different from U3, John?
Well, U3 is a headline number, and in order what a U3 unemployed person has different from the other categories is that he or she has been actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks. If you've given up looking for work or have not looked for work in the last 4 weeks because there are no jobs to be had, but you still want a job, you take a job immediately if it were available, you're considered a discouraged worker. Now, the difference there between the U.S. and Canada is that in Canada you count discouraged workers the way we used to before 1994. And that is, once you're discouraged, you're considered discouraged, so long as you want a job, you'd like, you take the job, you're able to take it. The only thing that disqualifies you from being counted as currently unemployed, or and what the U.S. has as the U3 category, is that you haven't looked for work in the last 4 weeks. In 1994, the United States revised the definition on that to make it that you're only discouraged for the first year. After a year, then they don't count you at all. And so that where the U3 is at 8.3%, U6, which is the U.S. government's broadest measure, which includes the U3 component. It includes people working part-time for economic reasons where they can't find a full-time job, and it includes the discouraged workers. But what I call the long-term discouraged workers, so those who've been discouraged for more than a year, if you add them in, I mean, the U6 is at 15.1.
Wow.
You add them in, you'd be up around 22.5%, which is what I estimate. That's my. I work up my own calculations on the long-term discouraged workers. What I'm estimating is what you'd get if you went around the country and asked everyone if he or she were unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
The average guy knows whether or not he's unemployed. You add them all together, you get a much higher number than what the government officially estimates.